I guess, Hugh, one of the I love statistics, being a journalist, and a few of the lines in there caught me. That China's economy overtook Japan's this year. That compared to the United States, China's economy is already bigger than the Soviets was in comparison to America. And this one really got me, that 20 years ago, our economy was the same size as China's. Now China's economy is 4 times as big as ours. I wonder if you could explore that concept a little bit and explain why it matters if the economy is if getting so big.
Yeah, look, that's exactly the right place to start, because we're all very used to the fact that China is growing economically, and it's very much part of our daily lives, very much part of the texture of the way we think about Australia, that this is going to be terrifically important for us in our future, very important to us economically. But I think there are 2 aspects of it that we don't really pause and think about. The first is just how big a development that is in terms of the nature of China as a country. It was the biggest economy in the world for centuries, perhaps for millennia, until the Industrial Revolution. It was the Industrial Revolution which broke the nexus between the size of the population and the size of your economy, because the Industrial Revolution meant that some countries were much more productive per capita than others. And that's what allowed the British to overtake China to become the strongest economy in the world in about 1820. And what we've been seeing in the last 30 years is China having its industrial revolution. So this is not, so to speak, just another day out there in the global economy. This is a fundamental rebalancing of the global economy, and the bit that we find it hard to really get our head around is that if China keeps growing for the next 30 years, perhaps even only for the next 20 years, as fast as it has for the last 30, and I believe and argue in the essay that it probably will, then it will become the largest economy in the world. We have all grown up in a world in which the United States was the largest economy in the world. It's been that way since 1880. Our world has been made by American power. And I do think, at the risk of sounding like an old Marxist, which I'm not, I do think economics is what really counts. And that as China's economy grows, then, and this is the second of the 2 things that I think I started to reflect on, is that as China's economy grows, its political and strategic weight will grow too. That it will start to exercise a kind of power that we have not seen an Asian country exercise since this country in its modern form was founded in 1788. And that will fundamentally change the nature of our national environment, the nature of our strategic environment, and the way we need to relate to Asia.
And I mean, just a small thing. The other thing that I hadn't thought about was you saying that because Nixon goes to China, that in effect takes them out of the Cold War battle. So it means that we do engage with China's economy, but we don't engage them with them in a sort of geostrategic way.
Yeah, exactly. It seems to me that the most distinctive thing about Australia's international environment for the last 40 years, and I mean that almost quite, since Nixon went to China in 1972, has not just been that America has been the strongest power in Asia, it has been, but that its power has not been contested by any other Asian power. If you go back through the history of the earlier part of the 20th century up to 1972 in Asia, then, if you like, the big theme was that first Japan and then China were contesting the American presence. And that was terribly important. Australia's experience of anxiety and then war with Japan in the first half of the 20th century, and then our experience of the Cold War in Asia in the 50s and 60s that took us so often into Asia to fight Korea, Malaya, Vietnam. It was all about first Japan and then China contesting America's role in the Asia Pacific. What was very distinctive after 1972 is that both the Chinese and the Japanese, for their different reasons, said, OK, we'll accept American primacy. And it's the fact that American primacy has been uncontested that has made Asia so peaceful for the last 40 years. It's allowed all of that economic growth to take place, which has allowed Australia, as a very close ally of the United States, to nonetheless build this immense strategic economic relationship with China. And I have an uncomfortable feeling that we may look back on this period from the future and see it as a terrific golden age. It doesn't get much better than this. And of course we take it for granted. Now, I do think that the reason China's economic growth, that remarkable economic transformation that I touched on a minute ago, is so important politically and strategically is that as China's power grows, it will change its bid. It will no longer say, okay, we'll accept American primacy, you guys are in charge, we'll keep our heads down. Chinese for 150 years have aimed to make their country, and this is the slogan that they borrowed from the Japanese nationalists at the time, wealthy and strong. And as it becomes wealthy, they'll want it to become strong. Nothing necessarily wrong with that, but it's going to change the way Asia works.
I guess before we look at how power might be divided up, one of the things that we do all think about when we think about China is their internal political system.
Yes.
And quite apart from the criticisms that perhaps visiting American and Australian leaders might make, how do we know what's going to happen in the future with the internal dissent? I mean, you read a lot of indirect things about what's happening there, but what do you think how is the economy impacting on the internal problems in China?
It's a really critical question. As I said before, I think it's likely that China will keep growing to the point where it overtakes the United States to become the largest economy in the world, but I'm far from certain about that. Clearly a whole lot of possibilities, a whole lot of constraints on China continuing to grow. I think a lot of the argument that you see that kind of presupposes that there are inherent limits to China, that for some sort of inherent reason it can't grow to overtake the United States. I think that is wishful thinking. But I do think there are some specific features of the Chinese situation, the Chinese system, which do pose risks. And perhaps the most important of them is the internal politics. The fact is we're still seeing a country that's run by a Leninist political system, a one-party state, very impatient of political dissent, to put it mildly, and there is very little record in history of sustained economic growth being achieved under that kind of political system. And so you can make the argument, a lot of people do, that as long as China remains a Leninist state, it can't keep growing. Well, there are three parts of the answer to that. The first is, well, it has for 30 years. So, you've got to be a bit careful. Of course, drawing straight lines across the graph can get you into trouble, but assuming that China can't do for another 20 years what it's done for the last 30 years is a bit of a risky jump as well. The second point is, of course, that China is different from any other Leninist state, because China is the first Leninist party which has actually delivered sustained economic growth to its people. And so...
Yeah, you've got that remarkable line. I'm going to quote you at you if I can. In half a lifetime, the Chinese Communist Party has presided over the biggest increase in human welfare in human history. And now you call yourself not a Marxist, but that's quite an incredible...
Oh, it is. It's a remarkable thing. And yeah. I think one of the things one does have to focus on is what a remarkable transformation of individual lives has taken place in China. Now, my principal interest and focus is in looking at what China's growing power means for China as an international actor on the Asian stage, but you just sort of turn it around and look at what happens in China. And the fact is that, roughly speaking, 600 million people, 500 million people, in 30 years have been moved from $2 a day jobs to $25 a day jobs. Now, those $25 a day jobs are still pretty horrible. They're not ones we necessarily want to do ourselves. But with that does go a whole lot of genuine improvements in things that are really important. Better food, better houses, better healthcare, more education opportunities, and all of that. So, this is making poverty history. It doesn't look quite the way the people who wear the little armbands like it to look. They don't think, when they think of making poverty history, they don't think of Shanghai today. But that is actually what it looks like when you make poverty history. The trouble with making poverty history is that when people have money, they start spending it just the way we do, which can sometimes be a bit disconcerting. But I think the other side of that coin is that there are, of course, still very deep injustices in China, very deep inequalities in China, and there must be a big reservoir of unsatisfied longing for more political participation amongst people who, if they follow the pattern we've seen in every other society in the world over the last couple of centuries as they've made this transition to greater prosperity, they will want more political participation. Some people assume that an irresistible urge for political participation from the Chinese people will meet the immovable determination of the Chinese Communist Party to hold on to power, and that the result will be an explosion, the kind that seemed nearly to happen at Tiananmen, which did happen, of course, all through Eastern Europe. I don't think we should assume, if I can put it this way, reassure ourselves that the Chinese will mismanage their affairs so grievously that they'll let that happen, and that therefore that will make the thing stop.
I guess I wonder, you say a few times what the Chinese people will want.
Yes.
Which of course is a very difficult thing to do with
say.
how, more than 1 billion people. But one of the lines you said, it's unlikely that the Chinese people will still willingly accept a subordinate position to America. And that's clearly part of the thesis, is they don't want to share power. But I wonder how much, when you say the Chinese people, are you just talking about the government, or do you think there is that internal trade-off within China that people want that sort of, to explore their manifest destiny, all those sort of things? Is that part of the reason that China will want to flex part of its muscle?
Look, I think it is, and I think it's a very important part of the picture, and it's one we have to look at very carefully, and one we have to watch ourselves looking at very carefully. It's a very hard thing to observe impartially, if I can put it this way. Of course, a lot of Chinese people very reasonably grumble, and more than grumble, about things their government does. But nonetheless, my impression is, I don't speak Chinese, I don't regard myself as an expert on China in the sort of sense of our foreign minister, but I do think, I do see when I speak to Chinese, when I follow the views of people who study China much more closely than I can from my position of monolinguistic incompetence, that these are people who are immensely proud of what their country's achieved. I live on Anzac Parade in Canberra, and when the big Chinese demonstration in support of the Olympic torch occurred, I was working away at something at my desk. I looked up from my desk and I saw above our hedge a frieze of red flags. Looked like something from a sort of Maoist-era propaganda poster. And I hadn't realised this whole thing was happening, and I looked up, what the... Anyway, I went outside and walked amongst these people, and there was an edge to it, quite a nasty edge in some ways, because it was, in a sense, an anti-Tibetan demonstration, amongst other things. But those, mostly students, mostly brought in from all over Australia, the overwhelming aura of that group was just immense pride in what China had achieved. And you can imagine how young Chinese must feel, and if for that matter, Chinese my age must feel, Chinese who grew up during the Cultural Revolution and have seen China do what it's doing today. I mean, why, in a sense, why wouldn't they be proud of what they've achieved, notwithstanding all the reservations and all the anxieties and all I think, genuine injustices as well. And I think one of the things that translates into is a great sense that their country should be a leader in the world. And there's a very potent psychological mix, I think, at work in China today, because they bring to the question of their status in the international system, of course, an intense sense of past greatness, civilization stretching back a long way, and of which, of course, they're intensely conscious. Then a very strong sense of recent humiliation. This is something we don't quite get. We don't understand, I think many Westerners, I think many Australians don't understand just how deeply the Chinese feel what the West did to it during the period of colonial, it's not quite the right word technically, but of European intrusion, dismemberment of the Chinese state through the 19th century, particularly after the Opium Wars, and right through up to the reunification under the communists in the late 40s. So past greatness, recent humiliation, immense pride in present achievements, and a very strong confidence in future greatness. And the psychological combination of all of those things together does make a pretty heady brew. So it just so seemed to me that the likelihood that China will not seek, and not just the hard guys in the Politburo, but the Chinese people will expect their leaders to seek for China a leading role in Asia, and not just a leading role as a manufacturer of flat-screen televisions, but a leading state. Yeah. State. This is all about state power in a very old-fashioned sense.
There was actually two stories today in our paper. I didn't mean this to be an advert, but one of them was the whole of the Chinese people greeting the Chinese battleship in Sydney.
Yes.
And also this dispute over another series of islands between Japan and China.
Yes.
And that there's that real push from some groups within China. I'm sure they have government connections, but they're not the government.
Yes.
But groups within China really pushing for a tough military stance.
Oh, look, that's right. I mean, I think there's two different processes at work there. One is that China is becoming a bigger player. Its military is growing. Its military diplomacy is spreading, including in this part of the world. I don't think we need necessarily zoom around and ring the alarm bells, Russians are coming style. But I don't think we should also recognise that this is a reflection of a country that sees its role in Asia different from the role they've had 20 years ago, and 20 years from now they expect it to be different again. So this is, so to speak, part of a growing pattern, to put it mildly. But the other side of the coin is that there is, particularly vis-a-vis Japan, a very deep nationalist sentiment which goes back to the Japanese invasion and all the terrible things that happened then. These are unresolved issues between China and Japan. They are things which, in some respects, I think it would be fair to say, some aspects of the way China tells that story exacerbate anti-Japanese feeling in China. But I think it would be a big mistake to see it as an artefact of the Chinese Communist Party propaganda or education department. This is very deeply felt. One wants to be aware of being too anecdotal about this, but when I was working in government, I did once sit at a very small table with the then Chinese defence minister, this is in the early 90s, who had fought against the Japanese and who described in quite good English and very poignant English, at least his account of what had happened to his village. And, this went pretty deep, this was pretty sincere, and it was pretty scary too. So I don't think the anti-Japanese sentiment is confected, and I do think it's one of the reasons why management of China's aspirations, and for that matter Japan's place in Asia, which I think is a very critical and complex and uncertain thing, is going to be hard. These are not countries that naturally get on very well.
Just before we get on, I guess, to what America should do and what Australia might choose to do, it would be good to look, I think I've sort of called them, you've gone through a series of scenarios in the essay about how it's going to end up, which paths China might take. And so perhaps we should have a bit of futurology. Let's look at what China might do before we ask what Australia should do.
Well, one of the questions I'm trying to answer in the essay is what might China want to do with its power? And my way of doing that is simply to ask what are, for China, the benefits of different approaches to maximising its power. My starting point is that I think China will probably want to maximise its power, but of course it wants to maximise it without disturbing the region, because of course China needs the region to keep working reasonably well. Its economy depends on regional cooperation just as much as ours or America's does. So China has a classic dilemma. It wants to maximise its power without causing disorder. So how does it strike that balance? Well, one possibility, of course, and one that a lot of people fear, is that China will try and establish a kind of a hard-edged, militarist, Stalinist-style hegemony over Asia. And, this is partly because it's a communist country, and one tends to think communist country equals Stalinist foreign policy. I don't rule that out as a possibility in the future. I don't think we could say that there's no chance that China would ever behave in that way. But I've got to say, I think the chances of that happening in the next few decades are relatively low. That's not the thing I worry about most. And I have two reasons for saying that. The first is I don't see evidence within the Chinese own discussion of their strategic situation of wanting that, and I see nothing in the way China's building their armed forces to suggest that they want to do that thing in particular, though they certainly want to increase their power. But the other reason is I think the Chinese understand that they're not strong enough to do it, even when they're the strongest economy in the world. Even if they keep growing remarkably for the next few decades, they are, in the face of American power, the power that America will still have, in the face of the Japanese power, which I take very seriously, in the face of Indian power, I think it would be massively disruptive for China to try and do that. I think we can, in effect, stop China doing that. The better option from China's point of view is to try and establish a soft hegemony, and I think this probably is what the Chinese think about. They'd like to be accepted as the leader of Asia. They'd rather not, like Stalin, have to impose that militarily. And when they look at what a soft leadership might look like, I think they probably look to the Western Hemisphere, look to America's leadership in North and South America, the Monroe Doctrine. America's in a pretty sweet wicket in the Western Hemisphere. Since 1824, it's been the uncontested leading power in the Western Hemisphere. It doesn't have to invade other people's countries, or not very often. You're broadly free if you're a Latin American country to get on running your own show, but if America's got an interest, there's no doubt America's interest is going to be paid attention to. There's no doubt America's leadership is very clear and unambiguous. And I think when the Chinese look at what they'd like, their vision of how they'd like their country to look 30 or 40 years from now, something that looks like American primacy in the Western Hemisphere, applied by them in the West Pacific, is pretty attractive. The trouble with that is that America in the Western Hemisphere doesn't face any other great powers, whereas China in our part of the world does, and in particular it faces Japan. It's a slightly flippant way of putting it perhaps, but I can imagine Australia, not without some big adjustments, but Australia acclimatising itself to become the kind of Argentina in that model of the Western Pacific. We'd be to China what Argentina is to the United States. But I can't imagine Japan being the Canada.
Yeah.
And I've tried that metaphor on many Japanese friends, and I've never got anything other than a very sour look indeed. So
I think this is also where you get attacked the most as well. And I want to give you a chance to respond to the attack. But when you're talking about this option, you use two phrases that I think people have picked up a lot. One is that the US could eventually decide to leave Asia to be run by China. And you also talk about the US surrendering supremacy.
Yes.
And this is the thing.
Yes.
I think the immediate response is, you're just talking about America interfering with us the same way America interfered, say, with Chile and Nicaragua. Therefore, your argument is unacceptable, and that's where they really leap on you.
No, look, I think that's right. And I mean, to put that in context, you've got to see it's important to look at the third option, because I actually don't think China can establish even the Monroe-style primacy in Asia, because it does have to face America probably, not certainly, and Japan and India eventually. And I therefore think actually for China the best thing to do would be to accept that it can't be the uncontested leader, American-style, Monroe Doctrine style in Asia, that it's the best it can hope for in a reasonably orderly way is to share power in Asia with Japan and the United States. I think that is absolutely, I'm sure that's absolutely China's lowest offer. Nothing less than that, less than being treated as an equal in a shared leadership structure in Asia. Anything less than that, China would not be counted as a great power. And the China that I see today is not going to settle for being less than a great power. So that, I think in this negotiation, that's going to be China's minimum position. The question is that going to be more than what America is prepared to offer? So are these negotiators going to meet in the middle? Because when you turn it around and look at America's options, America does, I think, have three choices as it confronts China's growing power. And it's worth bearing in mind that this is a unique challenge to American power. America has never before faced a strategic adversary whose economy threatened to grow bigger than theirs. It's not something the Soviet Union was ever going to do. It's not something that Japan was ever going to do. It is a new experience for the United States. I do think that China, if it keeps growing, is a more serious strategic adversary in the long term than the Soviet Union ever was. That's a strange thing to say because it's less threatening and less well armed than the Soviet Union was, but it's richer. And in the end, I do think money counts in this business. So we've got as America faces this, I think it has three choices. And this is going to sound like an oversimplification, but I think it is actually this simple. I think there's a kind of Euclidean clarity in the choice that America faces. It could withdraw. I don't think this is very likely, but I don't think anyone in Australia thinking about the future of Asia should overlook the possibility that if China keeps growing and America has to work out how do we respond to it, America has to ask itself, how much is it worth our while staying engaged in the Western Pacific? What are we doing there? Why does this work for us? Now, there's a series of answers that Americans give to those questions, and I think they're credible answers. But the credibility of those answers does start to wane as the costs and risks of staying engaged increase. So I don't think we can assume America stays engaged. It might withdraw. It could share. It could decide to meet China's minimum position and say, OK, you and us, instead of us being in charge, you and us will share power and we'll bring Japan and India in. We'll have a kind of a shared leadership. And as will be obvious, I guess, I do think that's the best option available
Can I stop you there, though?
Yeah.
That little catechism you used,
yes.
the questions that it might be, because it's something that they find quite difficult to...
In order to get, let me get... When I talk to Americans about this, when I say, do you want... I often run through a little catechism. And I say, do you guys want to live in peace with China? Oh, of course we do, absolutely. I say, are you prepared to treat China as an equal, as its power grows to equal and perhaps exceed yours? No, of course not. Quite an offensive proposition. And I mean, I don't mean that flippantly. I think a lot of Americans do find that. I think actually a lot of Australians actually find that quite an offensive proposition. Why should we treat China as an equal? My next question is, do you expect the Chinese to settle for anything less? And there's a pause, and they say, no, probably not. And so I say, well, what do you expect to have happen? And normally what happens then is shrug. Well, what that shrug means is the third option, because if you don't withdraw and you don't share, you compete. And I really don't think statesmen, politicians, journalists for that matter, academics keep on trying to find intermediate options between those. Oh, we can do a bit of both. No, I don't think you can. You're doing one of those three. If you're not sharing and you're not withdrawing, you're going to compete. And these things, of course, have a dynamic of their own. Once you start competing, the competition becomes more intense. And I think the risk for us is that the US will find itself drawn into strategic competition with China. It's very important to say, not just the US's fault. It takes two to tango. But the US and China will be drawn together into an intensifying strategic competition. And I do think that is very dangerous, because although one might hope that such strategic competition could be managed in a responsible, sensible way in which there was a bit of competition but it didn't get in the way of really important things like making money, actually the lesson of history is that once strategic competition starts, particularly between very strong states, the chances of that competition intensifying and amplifying and getting out of control and eventually resulting in a breakdown of economic interactions and a very significantly increased risk of war, and the risk that that war would be very big, that it would go nuclear, all of those things come on the table.
I just want to question two of those assumptions and then also throw something in that you mentioned. How do we know, I mean, you make the assumption that the conflict is going to be there. And I take your point where you say that, this is bigger than the global war on terrorism, as the Americans call it. It's bigger than Afghanistan, Iraq, bigger than the GFC. How do we know that conflict is inevitable? Because you make the point that they have that balance of economic terror, that if they harm the other side, they harm themselves.
That's exactly right.
It is possible that both could grow and there might not be a conflict, no?
It absolutely is possible. It's absolutely possible. My argument is not that escalating strategic competition, let alone conflict between the US and China, is inevitable. My argument is that that's a significant risk. And managing risks like that is a very important thing to do. Just because it's not inevitable doesn't mean you don't have to pay really careful attention to it. But I'd also press the point just a bit further, because, of course, you're absolutely right. Each side has an immense incentive to prevent this strategic competition getting in the way of their economic relationship, because they both really do depend on that. And what you would hope, in fact, what people have hoped since the late 18th century, is that trade brings peace, that as people trade, their inclination to...
They've got McDonald's, we've got McDonald's,
exactly,
we won't go to war.
Exactly, how could we go to war with one another? It's a very important point. They are genuine incentives. They do provide very good reasons on both sides for people to avoid strategic confrontation. But what strikes me is how little that seems to actually affect people's approach. And I think the reason for that is twofold. The first is that because people so willingly grasp at that life belt and say, look, we don't have to worry about this. We trade so much we can't go to war with one another. I think it actually stops them paying attention to what's going to be needed to prevent that happening, in the sense it engenders a complacency. People don't think it's necessary to work hard to prevent escalating strategic competition because they sort of assume it's impossible, even while it's actually happening. But I think there's a deeper reason in that as well, and that is that both sides think that economics poses a real constraint on competition, but they think the constraint applies to the other guy and not to them. I spend quite a lot of time talking to Americans and Chinese about this. And a very common pattern of conversation is for the Americans to say, look, Hugh, you're way too worried about this stuff. You know, this strategic competition can't get out of hand. Why not? Well, the Chinese aren't going to be dumb enough to let that happen. And I talk to Chinese and they say, Hugh, you're way too pessimistic about this. The Americans just are not dumb enough to let this happen. The fact is they both think there's a golden straitjacket. This was Thomas Friedman's phrase. There's a golden straitjacket that nobody can afford to misbehave because everyone has to keep the money flowing. But the fact is they each think the other side's wearing the golden straitjacket. They each think that economics constrains the other side's strategic position and not theirs. And you know, I think the risk is that both sides will allow themselves to slide into a position where they expect the other side to respond to the economic constraints so they don't have to.
Now, I'm interested in what you think about what they've said publicly and officially. I mean, we'll have time to talk about what Australia should do, but you point to some of Obama's language. I think it's from his speech where he's talking about the troops in Afghanistan actually.
Yeah.
But just talk about his language and what do you think Obama means with his public pronouncements so far on China?
Well, I think, to me, one of the really distinctive things about the way in which this issue plays out is that both sides, both the US and China, avoid it publicly. They don't talk about it publicly. The Chinese do that as a deliberate act of policy. That is, they adopted a policy right back in the 1980s that as their power grew, their trick was going to be, their challenge was going to be to stop people getting anxious about their power. So, and Deng Xiaoping had a slogan about this, you know, always understate our power, don't seek leadership, keep your head down, don't let them see how strong we're getting. And, you know, when everyone who deals with the Chinese on these issues is familiar with the Chinese saying, oh, we're a very poor country. I mean, they were saying that when they were the fifth strongest economy in the world, and they were still saying it when they were the fourth, and now they're the second strongest economy in the world. And they're still saying, oh, we're a very poor country. No, you're not. So I think they deliberately suppress the conversation. And there's a reason for that. From China's point of view, the later the negotiation happens, the better off they are. Because the balance, you know, time is working on their side. On America's side, something different's happening. I think Americans have found it very difficult to come to terms with the strategic implications of China's growing power, have found it hard to come to terms with the probability that they will not be the strongest economy in the world 20 or 30 years from now. They, I think, would anyway find that hard to come to terms with, and I don't blame them for that. But I think 9/11 made that even harder to come to terms with. It's been a massive distraction. I have a kind of a tentative hypothesis that it may well be the biggest long-term strategic implication of the 9/11 attacks will be that it made it almost impossible for America to respond more effectively to what really was the biggest strategic challenge they faced over this era. And so I think there's what you don't see in the United States is a clear articulation of how America should respond, because there's a very strong assumption in the United States that they will remain the dominant power in Asia, even as the economic relativities shift. And I think 2009 was the year in which that pattern started to break up. And you can see this in when Barack Obama announced the surge of troops to Afghanistan, a speech in West Point on the 1st of December last year. Most of the headline, most of the attention was on the fact that he announced an extra 30,000 troops and then simultaneously announced a deadline for withdrawal. But he had a passage in the speech in which he explained why that was so. And I don't want to verbal the bloke, but roughly speaking, he said, we, America, can no longer assume we've got enough power to do everything we want. There are some very big, tough competitors out there, and for us to be sure that we can play the kind of role we want to play in the world in the future, we're going to have to husband our resources much more carefully. Therefore, we need to get out of Afghanistan.
And he said prosperity provides a foundation for our power. Which
exactly. That's exactly it. And he didn't mention China, but he did in 2009. He didn't have to. You know, this was the year. I mean, I think one of the things that drew China to the centre of America's attention in 2009, perhaps the most important thing, was the global financial crisis. I think that was the point at which Americans really turned around and realised just how big and strong and powerful China had become.
Okay, look, now I want to... I love the Australian because they're just great fodder. I so don't agree with them.
They love me too, you know.
But they just, you know, sometimes they know how to say outrageous things. I do, if you didn't manage to catch Greg Sheridan's views on Hugh's essay. Some of his choice lines that Hugh has written the single stupidest strategic document ever prepared in Australian history by someone who once held a position of some responsibility. And what was the other? There was another great one. White determines that the chief task for Australian diplomacy is to persuade the Americans to give up their Asian primacy. This is, without question, the single dumbest suggestion for Australian foreign policy from a once mainstream character in many a long year. My personal opinion of the Australians, they fire about 100 bullets, and if they know that if 3 hit their target, they've sort of done their job. With that as a starting point, and feel free to respond, what does it mean, how do you think most people here in government are responding to what you've said? Yep. And what are the different choices that Australia might take?
Look, this is a very difficult issue for Australia. And, it's a difficult issue for me. It's a pretty important point from my point of view. I am not, in any sense, an anti-American person. I've spent my whole career, most of my career, working in and around government. But
there are some very serious people who would agree with what Greg says and would see that you're sort of an unknowing anti-American.
I would resist that, I think. I think that there's a very strong presumption. Let me put this a different way. The US alliance has been fantastically good for Australia hitherto. American uncontested primacy has worked very well for us. And although there are things that Americans do that lots of people don't like, on balance, American power has been very, very good for Australia indeed. And the US alliance has worked very well for Australia indeed. Now, the problem for us is that the circumstances in which the US alliance worked well are starting to change. I take a very positive view of what the US alliance does, but I take a rather cool view of why it does it. It's easy to see the US alliance, particularly when you the way it's often talked about, that is virtues derived from sort of deep intrinsic features of the shared values and histories and culture and all of that sort of stuff. I've never seen the alliance that way. I've always seen the alliance as a cost-effective strategic policy instrument for Australia in particular strategic circumstances. I therefore think that if the circumstances change, our view of the alliance might change. It's worth making the point that it's no part of my argument that we should dump the alliance. My argument is that we should think very carefully about what are the circumstances in Asia how will our approach to the alliance change as circumstances in Asia change. And I recognise that there are some circumstances in which the alliance might not be the right thing for us. I don't advocate that those circumstances are the one we want to bring about. But underlying this most profoundly is that I do think there is a kind of timidity or denial going on in some of this. Australians are absolutely convinced that that we can model the future of our economy on the assumption that China will keep growing indefinitely. But many Australians are also convinced that we can continue to assume that the United States will retain uncontested primacy in Asia indefinitely. And my simple proposition at the heart of my essay is that these can't both be true at once. If China grows far enough and fast enough to deliver to us what we expect economically, it will grow far enough and fast enough to render American uncontested primacy unsustainable. Now, when Greg and others, I think it's fair to say, when they look at my argument, they say, but we don't want this to happen. We want America to remain the dominant power in Asia. And I, frankly, and I say this in the essay in words of one syllable, I would too. If I could have my choice, if somebody asked me to tick a box, I would say continued US primacy is the best outcome for Australia by far. But that's not what's going to happen if China keeps growing. The question for us is not do we want that to keep happening. The question is what's the best possibility for us if that doesn't happen. And I do think we're now increasingly in a world in which that outcome is very unlikely. So part of my response to Greg is I'm not advocating that the United States should give up primacy if it doesn't have to. I'm saying that giving up primacy might be the best outcome for creating a stable Asia, and it could well be the best outcome for the United States. A proposition that the United States' best interests are served by entering into a deep and bitter, protracted and possibly warlike strategic competition with the world's second strongest economy doesn't seem to me to be self-evidently the best thing for them.
So you propose this sort of, your best future option is this concert of Europe idea, sort of sharing of interests. Yeah. And because we don't have a well-enunciated China policy from our current Prime Minister, let's go back to the then Prime Minister, current Foreign Minister's policy, and two things. One, the Asian community idea, and two, lots of new submarines.
Yes.
Are these two things, is that the right way for Australia to go? Is that going to get us to that sort of sharing of power in Asia?
I think it's quite natural and perhaps inevitable that our policy response to this is going to be complicated. And there are going to be at least two components to it. The first is, I think Australia should take as a very serious national objective doing what we can to foster the development of a strategic order in Asia, particularly the relationship between the strongest states, which suits us, which is good for Australia. And I think that's one in which the United States continues to play the strongest possible role it can in Asia, consistent with avoiding intensifying strategic competition with China. And my model for how that can be done is with this kind of model of a shared power structure in which the US and China and Japan and India all participate. And I use the model of 19th century Europe as a kind of a image of how that might work. And I think that's a very significant diplomatic task for us. I think Kevin Rudd, when he developed the Asia-Pacific community concept, certainly did, as part of that idea, he had in mind the thought that one of the things the APC should do is to help negotiate this new order. I think that was simply ill-conceived as a diplomatic initiative, because the idea of the APC was that you're going to have every country in the region, or a lot of countries in the region, I forget the number, 22 or 23, all together in the room, the big ones and the small ones and so on. And it's an iron law of diplomacy, as it is of most other walks of life, that no committee ever got better as it got bigger. And the idea that the US and China would sit down and negotiate their future relationship with another 20 countries in the room, all in a sort of a grand ballroom in a hotel in Singapore somewhere behind the crossed flags with little bowls of mints in front of them. This didn't sound right to me. This was going to be a very different kind of conversation. So I think one thing one might say is that Rudd was trying to deal himself into that conversation directly. And I think that's a misunderstanding of what's going on. I do think there is something Australia should do. Australia should go to Washington and go to Beijing and encourage others to go to Washington and Beijing and saying, we want Asia to look like this. We don't want it to look like that. But I don't think it's a matter of convening everyone in the room together. So there is a diplomatic story. And as so often with Rudd, the idea of the Asia-Pacific community indicated that he had the right idea about what needed to be done, but it also indicated he didn't work out how best to make it happen.
And just before we open it up to questions, the subs, is that
the other side of the coin, as I said, there are two things we need to do. The first thing is we need to try and do what we can to help foster the Asia that works for us best. The second is, I think in all responsibility, is we've got to work out what do we do if it doesn't work out like that. If Asia for the next 40 years is as peaceful as Asia's been for the last 40 years, then we don't need any submarines. The whole point about defence policy, at least those bits of defence policy, you might say you need an army to do odds and sods of things, but the big, expensive, scary stuff, the joint strike fighters, the submarines and all of that, we only need them if Asia's strategic order becomes more contested. But if Asia's strategic order becomes more contested, if we don't get a nice, stable concert of power model, then Australia does have to think very carefully about what kind of role it wants to play in that very different kind of Asia, and what kind of role we want our armed forces to be able to play in establishing our position in that kind of Asia, and therefore what kind of armed forces we need. And without going too far into the technicalities of force structuring, my argument, and this is an argument about there's a lot of steps in this which I'm missing out, but my basic argument is that the kinds of strategic objectives that Australia would want to be able to achieve in a more contested Asia are ones that are best achieved with submarines. So I myself would put a big priority on submarines. The difference between me and Kevin Rudd on submarines is not that the 12 that he nominated in his 2009 white paper were too many, but that there were too few and too late, if you believe that we're heading to
just explain the emphasis on submarines. Why submarines?
Okay.
Because at first glance, because I never really understood it myself until I read your essay.
Don't tempt me. This is my favourite subject in the whole world. I can get boring on this subject, but let me give you the short version. Australia is a fundamentally maritime strategic environment. We tend to think of ourselves, when we think of Australia militarily, we think of the army. But that's an accident of history. Geography tells us, the blue on the map tells us, that we're a country which, if it's going to exercise strategic weight in Asia, it's going to do it at sea. And it's not just the geography, it's also demographics and so on. Australia is never going to be, unless we replicate the achievements of our ancestors in 1914-18, we're never going to deploy a mass army, and we shouldn't deploy a mass army. It gets you to the War Memorial. We should aim, and we can most cost effectively exercise strategic weight in Asia at sea. Now, what do you want to do at sea? There are two broad propositions. One is you can try and control the sea, so you can send aircraft carriers and amphibious ships and so on around the joint. I think Australia will be very ill-advised to spend money trying to build sea control capabilities, because it's incredibly hard and it's going to get harder. I think we're going to enter an era in the Western Pacific in which no country, not even the United States, can achieve and sustain sea control for strategically significant periods of time in operationally significant places. The most you can do is denial. That is, stop the other guy using the sea. But the beauty of having an island continent, and not just an island continent, but an island continent in a very archipelagic place in the world, is that in a very contested Asia, and Asia looks very different from the Asia we've grown up in, but in a very contested Asia, being able to achieve sea denial for a country like Australia actually does a lot for us. And I have an argument that we can achieve our core strategic objectives, defend our most important strategic interests, with operations primarily focused around achieving sea denial, and submarines are the most cost-effective way of doing sea denial.
Sure.
My many friends in the Army and many of my friends in the Navy, that is the ones who sail surface ships, would disagree with that argument. I'm pretty confident of it.